There is a version of the Paleolithic we have constructed for ourselves that is clean and purposeful. The skilled hunter reading the wind, the healer gathering roots at dawn, the artisan shaping stone with practiced hands. These images are not invented. They rest on real evidence of real capability. But they have been laundered, the smell has been removed, the physical cost has been edited out. The full texture of what these roles actually required, of the body, of the senses, of the psychological tolerance of a person who had no alternative, has been quietly set aside in favor of something more watchable. What Paleolithic work actually looked like in the hours before and after any heroic moment was something far more confronting. It was soaked in biological material. It was repetitive beyond anything we associate with honest labor. It involved sustained contact with substances and conditions that every modern instinct in us recoils from. And it was performed not as a career choice or a calling, but as the simple price of staying alive in a world that made no allowances for squeamishness. The people who performed these roles were not extraordinary by their own standards. They were the ordinary workers of their era. What made them extraordinary is that they endured the full physical reality of work that we have since outsourced, industrialized, and eventually made invisible. And they did it without complaint, without alternative, and frequently without stopping. Begin with the tool maker. In every Paleolithic community, someone was responsible for producing the stone tools on which the group's survival depended. The scrapers, the burins, the hand axes, now the projectile points that made the difference between a successful hunt and starvation. Flint knapping, the controlled fracturing of stone to produce sharp-edged implements, is one of the most technically demanding manual skills in the archaeological record. Experimental archaeologists who attempt to replicate even basic Paleolithic tools typically require years of practice before producing anything that meets the functional standard of the originals. The craftspeople who built these tools to specification, under pressure, and in sufficient quantity to supply a mobile group of 40 people, were operating at a level of sustained technical mastery that commands genuine respect. But the physical environment in which they worked was quietly destroying them. Flint knapping produces a continuous spray of microflakes. Fragments of stone so small they are invisible in ordinary light, but large enough, when inhaled, to lacerate lung tissue. Every session at the knapping stone filled the air around the worker with silica dust, in concentrations that would trigger immediate evacuation of any modern occupational environment. Over months and years, this dust accumulated in the lung tissue, triggering an inflammatory response that produces dense, fibrous scar tissue in place of functioning alveoli. The condition is called silicosis. It is progressive, irreversible, and in advanced stages, fatal. Skeletal analysis of individuals identified through context as likely tool makers, those buried with knapping equipment, those found at workshop sites, shows evidence of chronic respiratory disease at rates consistent with sustained silica exposure throughout their working lives. The hands fared no better. Flint knapping requires bare-handed contact with edges capable of cutting to the bone. The cortex of the worked stone is relatively safe to handle. The fresh edges produced by each strike are not. Experimental knappers working without protection accumulate dozens of microcuts per session. These cuts healed. But in a Paleolithic context, every open wound on the hands of a person who was simultaneously handling raw meat, curing hides, and digging in soil contaminated with animal feces was a vector for infection. The knapper's hands were never clean. They were never, in any meaningful sense, safe. The debris field itself was its own hazard. A knapping session produced hundreds of waste flakes distributed across the ground around the worker, sharp, irregular, largely invisible once scattered in leaf litter or dirt. These flakes remain dangerous for decades after deposition. Walking barefoot or in thin hide footwear through a camp where knapping had occurred was its own occupational risk. Archaeological sites across Europe and the Near East yield dense concentrations of flint flakes around hearths and sleeping areas, a distribution pattern that indicates habitual use of the same space for both work and rest. The workers lived inside their hazard zone. There was nowhere else to live. The hide worker occupied a role so central to group survival that its absence would have meant death, not metaphorically, but literally, within a single winter. Animal hide, fully processed correctly, provided insulation against temperatures that killed unprotected humans within hours. Badly processed hide stiffened, cracked, failed to insulate, and rotted. The difference between a group that survived a northern European winter and one that did not often came down to the quality of its hides. Processing a large animal hide from raw to wearable required a sequence of steps, each more physically demanding and biologically confronting than the last. It began with defleshing, the removal of every fragment of fat, membrane, and muscle tissue from the interior surface of the skin using a stone scraper. This was not a delicate operation. It required hours of sustained mechanical force, working a scraper repeatedly across a hide stretched over a log or staked to the ground, producing a spray of tissue fragments and fluid that settled on the worker's hands, arms, and face. The hide at this stage was not odorless. It was the hide of a recently killed animal, and it smelled like one. The critical step was tanning, chemically altering the protein structure of the hide to prevent decomposition. Paleolithic hide workers used several methods, but the most widespread across archaeological and ethnographic evidence involved two substances: animal brain matter and urine. Brain tanning works because the lipids and lecithins in brain tissue penetrate the hide matrix and lubricate the protein fibers, preventing them from bonding rigidly during drying. Every animal killed for food produced roughly one brain, sufficient to tan its own hide. They were by a coincidence that our ancestors had identified and exploited for thousands of years. But the process required the worker to massage fresh or fermented brain matter directly into the wet hide with bare hands, working it into every surface over a period of hours. The material was not pre-processed into anything abstract. It was brain. Urine served as both a primary tanning agent and a pre-soak in many traditions, its ammonia content loosening the hide fibers and stripping residual hair. Large hides required large quantities. Communal urine collection was standard practice at sites where extensive hide working has been archaeologically identified. The distinctive chemical signature of urine concentration appears in soil samples from Paleolithic workshop areas. The worker who used this material was not making a degraded choice. They were deploying the most effective chemical agent available to them, but the sensory environment of a full day of hide working, the raw animal material, the brain emulsion, the urine soak, the scraping debris, all of it combined in the heat of a summer afternoon, was not an environment that any modern professional safety standard would permit a human being to enter without protective equipment. Then, the hide was smoked. Stretching the tanned hide over a small, smoldering fire drove smoke into the protein matrix, providing water resistance and a secondary preservative effect. The workers supervised this process at close range, managing the fire and rotating the hide for even penetration, breathing smoke continuously for hours. The finished product, supple, durable, and water-resistant, represented roughly 8 to 12 hours of sustained labor by a skilled worker who had inhaled, handled, and worn every biological stage of its production. Every Paleolithic community required someone with sufficient knowledge and sufficient nerve to intervene when the body failed catastrophically. We use the word healer loosely, as if it describes a gentle figure with an inventory of effective herbs. The reality was something both more impressive and more brutal. The Paleolithic medical toolkit contained genuine pharmacology. Analysis of plant material associated with burials and hearths confirms deliberate use of yarrow, ephedra, groundsel, and other species with measurable analgesic, anti-inflammatory, or antimicrobial properties. The healer who applied yarrow poultice to a wound was not performing ritual without effect. The yarrow was doing something real, but the gap between what Paleolithic medicine could do and what it was asked to do was enormous, and the person tasked with bridging that gap had to do so with their hands, their teeth, and their willingness to cause immediate pain in service of longer survival. Surgical intervention in the Paleolithic is not inference, it is direct evidence. Trephination, the deliberate drilling or scraping of a hole through the skull, appears in the archaeological record across multiple continents and multiple eras, with the earliest confirmed examples dating to approximately 6,500 BCE and possible precursors earlier. What is most remarkable about the trephination record is not the procedure itself, but its success rate. The majority of trephine skulls show evidence of bone regrowth around the opening, indicating that the patient survived the operation by months or years. Someone performed these procedures. Someone held the patient still, opened the skull with stone instruments under no chemical anesthesia beyond whatever analgesic plants were available, and managed the wound well enough that the patient did not die of immediate infection. Amputation of severely infected or traumatically destroyed limbs appears in the record as well. A 31,000-year-old skeleton from Borneo, described in research published in 2022, shows a clean amputation of the lower left leg, cut through cleanly, healed completely, the individual surviving for years afterward. Oh, this was not accidental. Someone made the decision, positioned the patient, cut through flesh and bone with the tools available, managed the hemorrhage, and kept the wound clean through a healing process that took months. The person who did this work had no sterile field, no sufficient analgesic, and no margin for hesitation. They had knowledge, physical capability, and the tolerance for the immediate suffering of another person that is the actual prerequisite of emergency medicine in any era. The healer's role was not peaceful. It was a sustained confrontation with the body at its worst. The infected, the broken, the dying, performed with instruments that would horrify a modern surgeon and a pharmacopoeia that was real but radically limited. They were effective where effectiveness was possible. And they worked every time in a field of screaming, blood, and biological material that the clean version of the word healer has never adequately captured. After a successful large hunt, the group faced a logistical problem of considerable scale: how to convert several hundred kilograms of animal into food and material before it became a toxic hazard. The butcher, or more accurately, everyone pressed into butchery work, operated under a time pressure that modern food processing has entirely eliminated, and a set of physical conditions that modern food safety standards exist specifically to prevent. A freshly killed large ungulate in summer conditions begins to show detectable bacterial proliferation within hours of death. By 12 hours, the internal organs, the first material to be processed and consumed, are in early stages of decomposition. By 24 hours in warm weather, the carcass is actively dangerous. The butchery crew worked against this clock with stone tools, extracting meat from a body that was simultaneously the most valuable resource in the camp's recent history, and a biological countdown. The work was conducted in direct physical contact with every anatomical system of a large animal. Intestinal processing alone, the removal, cleaning, and either consumption or discard of the digestive tract, exposed the worker to the full contents of the gut, partially digested vegetation, bile, intestinal bacteria, and fecal material, all of which had to be managed without contaminating the adjacent meat. Butchers working in these conditions did not wear protective clothing. They worked barehanded or in hides, absorbing blood, stomach contents, and organ fluids through the skin of their hands and forearms for the duration of the process, which in a large animal could extend through a full day. The pathogen risk was not theoretical. Zoonotic diseases, pathogens that transfer from animal to human during close handling of raw tissue, represent one of the oldest and most consistent sources of infectious disease in human history. Brucellosis, passed through contact with the reproductive tissues of infected animals, leaves characteristic lesions on vertebrae that appear in Paleolithic skeletal remains at multiple sites. Anthrax, present in grazing animals and transmissible through skin contact with infected carcasses, was a consistent hazard of any large butchery operation. The intestinal bacteria of wild ungulates are not identical to those of humans, and direct exposure through skin abrasions or mucous membranes created pathogen transfer opportunities that the butchery workers absorbed as a simple occupational condition. What the butcher produced, the group ate. What the butcher absorbed in the process was the cost of production, paid in skin and lung tissue and intestinal exposure every time an animal came down. Every Paleolithic camp required someone awake when everyone else was not. The night watch, the person who sat at the perimeter of the sleeping group through the coldest and darkest hours, is managing the fire that deterred predators and watching for the movement that distinguished wind from threat, was performing a role so unglamorous and so physically punishing that ethnographic accounts of hunter-gatherer societies consistently describe it as one of the most dreaded regular duties in any group's rotation. The cold was the first problem. Before the fire began to die, the temperature differential between the sleeping group clustered around its warmth, and the watch position at the edge of the firelight was already significant. As the fire declined, because fuel was finite and the watch position was too far to easily tend it, the cold advanced. Nighttime temperatures on the periglacial steppe of Pleistocene Europe dropped low enough to kill an unprotected human within hours. The watch sat in inadequate clothing, or in temperatures that caused progressive loss of fine motor control, maintaining alertness against the biological pressure of sleep deprivation, layered on top of a body already exhausted by the day's labor. The darkness beyond the firelight was not empty. This is the fact that the comfortable distance of modernity makes hardest to absorb. Cave lions, the largest felid of Pleistocene Europe, roughly 30% heavier than a modern African lion, were active hunters of humans in conditions of low visibility. Spotted hyenas in Paleolithic Europe were not the scavengers of modern imagination. They were pack hunters capable of coordinating against human groups and exploiting any moment of reduced vigilance. The wolf packs that surrounded human camps in northern environments were not the ancestors of domesticated dogs, but wild apex predators operating at the full scale of their ecological role. The watch sat between these animals and the sleeping people behind them. Their weapons were fire and noise, the torch thrown to deter approach, the shout that woke the group. What they could not do was eliminate the threat. What they could do was delay it long enough for the group to respond. This distinction between deterrence and protection was the psychological terrain of every night watch in the Paleolithic. You were not safe. You were slightly less exposed than the people sleeping behind you, and your continued alertness was the margin between their survival and its absence. Sleep deprivation in humans produces predictable cognitive and physical deterioration within 48 hours. The night watch rotated through members of the group, but the rotation was not relief from the condition. It was distribution of it. Every adult in a Paleolithic group carried some chronic sleep debt from interrupted nights, cold, noise, and the simple biological impossibility of deep sleep in an environment that provided continuous low-level threat signals to a nervous system that had evolved specifically to respond to them. There was no untroubled rest. There was only the degree to which exhaustion overcame vigilance. What connects these 5 roles is not their difficulty, though they were difficult beyond most modern equivalents. It is their invisibility. The napper's silicosis left no monument. The hide worker's 8 hours of biological contact produced a garment that wore out and was replaced and left no record. The healer's amputation kept one person walking for another decade, the evidence preserved only in bone that most of the world has never seen. The butcher's work fed the group and left nothing but a scatter of cut-marked bones that archaeologists interpret correctly as evidence of diet rather than experience. The watch's night produced nothing, the absence of an attack that cannot be counted. This is how most of human labor has always worked. The output is visible, the person is not. We have named our history after the kings and the battles and the monuments because kings and battles and monuments leave the kind of evidence that survives. But beneath every named event in the human record, there is an unbroken chain of anonymous physical work performed by people who had no expectation of being remembered and no time to think about it. They were too busy. The hide needed tanning, the wound needed closing, the fire needed tending. There is one more dimension to these roles that the fossil record cannot capture, but that we should not pass over. Every one of these workers was embedded in a social structure that depended on their continued function. The napper who stopped napping because their lungs had finally given out was not replaced by a market mechanism or an automated system. They were replaced by someone who had to learn the skill under pressure, probably in a season when tool failure was not an abstraction. The hide worker who died of a wound infection in October left the group facing a winter with fewer warm garments than it needed. The healer who fell ill had no backup. The cost of every breakdown in these roles was paid immediately in survival outcomes by the people around the worker. This is what it meant to be essential before the word had been diluted by modern usage. Not valued, not appreciated, structurally irreplaceable, in a system that had no redundancy and no tolerance for prolonged absence. We are the direct inheritance of every one of them, not metaphorically, biologically. The chain of survival that produced us runs through every watch shift completed in the cold, every infected hand that did not kill its owner, every hide worker who endured one more day of brain